The vampires of the old world claim dominion over the mortal remains of all earthly creatures. To die is to surrender oneself to their power. The generals of the Empire claim that the night is always darkest before the dawn. The warrior priests of Sigmar preach that there is hope yet, but they know little of the games immortals play. Patient, cunning, devious, the vampires work to conquer the lands of the living with ancient and corrupted sorcery. Should they succeed in their dread goals, the rays of the sun shall be forever suffocated by the night, and the age of men will be replaced by an age of undeath. The world will be transformed into a ghastly necropolis of mindless and unliving slaves, ruled over by the iron will of the vampire counts. The warriors that mostly comprise the armies of the vampire counts are known throughout both history and legend as those of the unliving brought about by the use of necromancy. Most, if not all, vampires have a certain affinity with necromancy, a unique form of sorcery that derives from the use of the black arts, also known as Dar or dark magic. It is in itself a direct contradiction to the winds of Shaiish, where, while Shaiish follows and embraces the certainty of death, the use of necromancy is meant to evade or strive to prevent it. It is thus a key element within the Vampire Count's armies. When a vampire lord wishes to bring war upon the Empire or against other enemy factions, they would often raise the dead of Sylvania from their graves with either their own sorceress abilities or from their personal coven of necromancers. These powerful individuals are what keeps the undead army together, for without them, the dark magic that controls and holds these walking corpses together would soon dissipate, often crumbling into simple scraps of rusted armor or broken bones. The bulk of their armies consist almost entirely of raised zombies or armored skeletal warriors. These unliving abominations have not a single flicker of sentience within them, and cannot operate independently without a necromancer or sorcerer to guide them. Although mindless, these undead are nonetheless also fairly resilient to many other factors that might hinder other living armies. Such advantages include not being hindered by the need for food, sleep, or the touch of the cruel elements, as well as having the inability to feel fear, for they lack the sentience to feel such complex emotions. Other than the raised dead, however, the vampire counts have also made extensive use of horrible creatures and grotesque abominations that have taken residence within the lands of Sylvania. These creatures come in all grotesque shapes and sizes, from the towering ghoul kings to the flying horrors of the Warbeasts. Through the use of dark magic, these creatures are bound to the will of a particularly powerful necromancer. Due to these creatures having extremely low intellect, they are often as mindless in their advance as any unliving creature, with the only sole motivation in their mind being the consumption of human flesh. Other times they've even bound the souls of the deceased into their service. While such property belongs to the Death God respectively, the Necromancer does not fear the punishments of his actions and would lure these restless souls into his army by means of a ritual involving dark magic. From the wailing banshees to the ethereal hex race, these lost souls have lost their will of control and are forced to do the bidding of their hated master. When engaged in battle, the ability for the vampire to both directly manipulate and control his warriors proved pivotal to their success on the battlefield. With almost methodological planning, these undead warriors would rally into neatly formed ranks and would endure almost anything thrown against them. With the ability to resurrect the fallen almost at a whim, the tactics employed by the vampire counts consist almost entirely on the use of attrition warfare. As the undead ranks absorb the enemy attack, their ranks would be continuously bolstered by freshly resurrected warriors from their own warriors and those of the enemies. Eventually, the dead would so outnumber the living that victory is almost inevitably ensured. However, herein lies the single greatest weakness that comes to all their kind. For should the powerful necromancer that controls the army die, so too will the entire army crumble into ruins. I suffered most grievously when I first fought them. They were slow enough in reacting that I saw an opening to cut the first one almost in half with my sword. I was expecting him to drop to the ground, and that's how he got his own sword into my shoulder. I fought on, but by the time we beat them, those of us who lived were all bleeding, most of us from several wounds. It wasn't enough to outfight them. We had to try to outlast them too. From Stedmar Holst, an Imperial soldier. Zombies are shambling horrors that are used extensively by the vampire counts and other undead powers as simple cannon fodder, staggering towards the enemy battle line in a slow yet noisome horde. Grotesquely reanimated corpses, zombies are compelled by the dark magic of a vampire or necromancer and driven by the will of their master to commit acts of extreme violence. They are truly foul things to behold, living corpses that are wroth with decay and unclean flesh. A zombie's skin hangs in strips from his tattered frame, revealing withered muscle and bloodless veins. With the use of dark magic, these zombies stagger towards the enemies with grasping arms and teeth. Yet zombies are often made from more than just corpses. For when the vampire counts are on the war path, their necromancers are often forced to improvise in order to amass a truly unstoppable horde. Spiked and rusting railings from graveyard fences are substitute for missing limbs. Broken backs are butt-dressed by mouldering planks or hammered into a semblance of solidity with rusted coffin nails. Fingers hacked off by wild sword thrusts are replaced with jagged spikes and elven arrowheads. Any debilitating wound they suffer is compensated for with stomach-churning expediency, for all that a zombie's master requires of it is to stumble into battle. For all their horrific appearance, zombies are slow and clumsy, making it easy for local militia and adventuring warbands to destroy individuals or even to bring down small groups without any casualties. Unfortunately, the old world boasts a rich supply of corpses, and thus zombies can be raised and set loose upon the living in overwhelming numbers. The sickening undead have no skill to speak of, but are instead driven only by the insatiable urge to rend, kill, and consume the living. Any warrior unfortunate enough to be pulled down by a zombie horde will find himself torn slowly apart by a mass of desperate clawing fingers, his flesh gouged from his body in grisly, glistening chunks. The fortunate die quickly, but those unlucky souls who are trampled beneath the horde spend their death throes in miserable agony as their innards become a crimson feast. Soldiers who have met in battle with the undead before, or who hear the terrifying tales whispered at campfires, know the best methods with which to slay the restless dead. A blow to the skull with a hammer or axe will slay a zombie outright, and severing the head is an even surer method of destruction. But precise strikes such as these take focus and skill, and zombies are seldom found in ones or twos. Instead, these Death Walkers are raised in large numbers, gathering upon the battlefield in their hundreds. Against hordes such as these, even the strongest sword arms tire, the stoutest hearts can falter, and the most skilled blades can become lodged in putrid flesh. Even those of surpassing skill will eventually feel the clammy touch of dead hands upon their skin. Zombies are easily sustained by the powers of necromancy, jerking back to their feet like jangling puppets as invisible force swirls around them. Their numbers can seem almost infinite as they press relentlessly forward. Those that fall in battle are compelled by necromantic power to stagger or crawl towards the foe moments after being cut down. Such shuffling hordes are often used by vampires to exhaust the regiments of their enemies, slowly overwhelming the foe in a ceaseless tide of blood-slicked, maggot-ridden flesh. However you look at it, the skeleton is a perfect symbol of both death and undeath, that part which endures after the rotting of the body and the departure of the soul. Fitting then that these are among our most feared and numerous soldiers. What human could hope to resist death? From Constantine von Karstein, a vampire lord. Skeleton warriors are, as their name implies, skeletons that have been raised from their graves to fight, willingly or not, on the behalf of the necromancer who raised them, forming the overall backbone of most undead armies under the control of the vampire counts. For thousands of years, armies have marched and fought across the old world since the time of its creation. There is barely a field, hill, or valley that has not seen fierce fighting at some point in the past, going as far back as the reign of Sigmar Heldenhammer, and even earlier. These great battles have left many unmarked and unblessed graves scattered all across the world. Such charnel fields often attract large influxes of dark magic, forcing the souls of some warriors to remain trapped within the material realm. Some are the spirits of men betrayed by their commanders, others of cowards who were cut down as they ran, or of those who died a violent and unexpected death. Unable to find peace due to their actions, these spirits are forever bound to the dead corpse that lies within the earth. Beneath the mud lie the grave-stained bones of these bitter ancient warriors. Long held beneath the earth, they are clad in corroded armor, their lifeless hands still gripping the swords, axes, spears, and shields they held during the time of their death. Provided their remains have not been blessed by the rites of Mor, a spirit is therefore vulnerable to the sorcerous abilities of a necromancer or vampire, where they use the coiling energies of dark magic to instill a semblance of life and a flicker of spirit into these dormant warriors. As the regiments of past massacres claw their way to the surface, their empty eye sockets have been known to glow an eerie light, a small flicker of semblance of their former personality. Silently, these corpses would gather together in a semblance of their old ranks, mutely awaiting the commands of their new lord as the remains of their tattered banners flap in the unnatural breeze of their creation. Though a skeleton no longer possesses flesh to cut, nor organs to pierce, a well-aimed blow can still destroy it and release the spirit that is trapped within. Dark magic is used to replace flesh that has long since been dissolved from the bones, but an arrow or sword thrust can disrupt the magic that binds the ancient bones of these soldiers together. Decapitation or severing of the spine is usually the most effective means to release the skeleton warrior's spirit from the mortal plane, and a heavy blow from a bludgeoning weapon such as a hammer or club can easily shatter an entire skeleton into pieces. However, even those that are felled can be raised up again as necromantic power knits together shattered bones and instills them with vigor once more. All that these long-dead fighters can recall of in their mortal life are faint impressions from battles fought in ages past. All that they feel is the compulsion to fight and obey their masters. They have no autonomy or intelligence, though some vestige of their battlefield training remains ingrained in their bones. Driven by the undying will of a vampire, these ragged warriors can still wield their swords and spears and raise a shield to block an enemy attack. A mortal who dares to fight an army of skeletons is confronted by rank upon rank of ghastly apparitions. Imbued without the need to eat, sleep, or feel the touch of fear, these skeletons are a horrible sight to all those of the living. What man would willingly march to war under the banners of the undead? And why do the counts tolerate these warm-blooded folk and induct them into their otherwise rotting and fleshless ranks? It is hard to understand either of these questions, and I will never be able to fully come to terms with the answers. From Grand Marshal Blucher von Winker. Although the armies of the vampire counts consist predominantly of undead raised through necromancy, in some cases, units of Sylvanian peasant levies have followed their von Carstein masters into battle. The peasants of Sylvania live grim and joyless lives in constant fear of their vampiric overlords. Thus, just as the human rulers of other nations press their peasants into service, so do the vampire counts of Sylvania. In battle, they are not a very effective fighting force, but are used in a similar manner as zombies or skeletal infantry. However, they are capable of independent thought, which can give them an advantage over their lifeless comrades in arms. In particular, they fight with the grim desperation of a man more afraid of his commander than his foes. And of course, when the levies die in battle, they can simply be reanimated. Sylvanian peasant levies are sometimes armed by the vampire counts, but usually carry their own weapons. Thus, they are typically found carrying spears, staves, spikes, axes, hammers, skiffs, farm implements, hunting bows, and occasionally crossbows or handguns. What man would willingly march to war under the banners of the undead? And why do the counts tolerate these warm-blooded folk and induct them into their otherwise rotting and fleshless ranks? It is hard to understand either of these questions, and I will never be able to fully come to terms with the answers. From Grand Marshal Blucher von Winker. Not as scary as they look, but you have to be careful of those poisoned claws. I could never work out whether they were really undead or not either. Not that it's too important. You can kill them easily enough with cold steel. No need for magic weapons and spells. From Captain Schultz, a mercenary commander. Crypt ghouls, also known simply as ghouls, are the degenerated descendants of humans who were reduced to cannibalistic creatures due to the consumption of raw or decaying flesh. Crypt ghouls are ugly, stooping creatures with only a vestigial sense of their former life or personality. Their skin is sallow and filthy, their eyes are bestial and insane, and their snarling lips reveal sharp, pointed teeth in slavering mouths. Dressed only in the rags they pull from their victims, crypt ghouls carry weapons they have picked up or have crudely fashioned from the remains of their unwholesome meals. Usually, these sulking fiends do not need such implements to kill, for they have long claws and powerful teeth sufficient enough for their needs. These claws are encrusted with grave filth and decaying meat. Those that take even the lightest scratch from their talons can die from unnaturally potent infections that spread through the victim's body. In addition, their constant diet of rot-fouled meat confers a sinewy and unwholesome resilience from most diseases. Though not truly undead, crypt ghouls unconsciously feel the dark magic that surrounds the most powerful undead lords and are drawn inexorably towards it. Once their presence is betrayed, their newfound master quickly dominates their weak and willing minds. Though they will lope into battle at the behest of their master, crypt ghouls and even their ghastly pack leaders are cowardly creatures that will slink away from combat if their prey seems to be fighting back with any real determination. This innate cowardice can be overcome by a mental command from their vampiric masters. For those ghouls who have fled can be coerced back to the front lines with the lure of dark magic. The first ghouls were the descendants of the insane and evil-hearted cannibals living within the jungles of the Southlands. Men who ate the flesh of their dead in gory rituals. These primitive corpse eaters lived upon the shores of the Sour Sea, drawn to dwell under the looming, freezing shadow of Nagashizar. The tribes worshipped the great necromancer and frequently partook of the dark feast. They would gorge themselves on the flesh of their own, and generation by generation, they were driven mad by their own loathsome practices. Now, these devolved humanoids roam an area of landscape known simply as the Desolation of Nagash, preying on travelers in their search for fresh meat. Even in the enlightened era of Emperor Karl Franz, there are tales of cannibalism within the borders of the Empire. During times of harsh pestilence and famine, the desperate and the depraved take to eating human flesh to stay alive. The stories tell that isolated farms and sometimes even whole villages have devolved into this vile state after consuming both raw and decaying flesh after a particularly long enough time. Some even claim the practice has become customary rather than necessary. During the ghoul swarms of 2512, when the crops failed for the third year running, the knightly orders of Stirland were employed en masse to scour the borders of their barren realm. The full-scale battle between the brightly clad soldiery of the Elector Count and the ravenous, blotched-skinned hordes of the afflicted villages has not been easily forgotten. Their fields and shabby hamlets were burned to the ground, but the memory of their foulness lingers on. The priests of Mor do what they can to protect their holy gardens against the encroachments of crypt ghouls, but many of the old world's graveyards and cemeteries date back 1,000 years or more, and beneath them are labyrinth of subterranean chambers and tunnels. On occasion, the Brotherhood of Mor will employ a professional witch hunter to sweep the catacombs with sword and fire to reduce their numbers. In battle, ghouls often attack enemies in large packs, where they use their speed and numbers to either ambush or encircle their enemies. Lacking any proper armor, weapons, or even discipline, these ghouls would act much in the same way as wild wolves, where they would often pick the weakest amongst their numbers and slowly drag the enemy down one by one. These ghouls are especially effective against enemies that are either scattered or in a rout, for without their military formation, each enemy soldier becomes easy prey for any singular ghoul to tackle alone. These creatures always amuse me. Oh, certainly they can be useful, having minions who can go out in the daylight. However much they might not want to, is not to be underrated. Yet the irony is not lost on me that I have some humans who are so desperate for the scraps from my table that they will even fight the rest of you for the chance to bite on a few corpses. From Constantine von Carstein, a vampire lord. Crypt horrors are a variation of common ghouls who have consumed the blood of a vampire, giving them supernatural size and strength. They are used by many undead factions as a form of elite heavy shock infantry. The malformed monstrosities known as crypt horrors are, thankfully, a rare sight, spoken of in hushed whispers by night watchmen, old priests of Mor, grave keepers, and other nocturnal citizens of the Empire. The few persistent reports of these looming and moon-mad fiends are dismissed as the ravings of superstitious fools. At best, they are thought to be exaggerated sightings of unnaturally large crypt ghouls. Unfortunately for the lands of the old world, however, the stories are often accurate, for crypt horrors are very real. In order to create a crypt horror, a vampire must open his veins to a ghoul and allow it to gulp down his precious blood, which is essentially a pale bastardization of the blood kiss, and an act that is reviled by those who count themselves amongst the elite of Sylvanian society. As such, these acts are often perpetrated by only the most desperate of vampires, most specifically the vampires of the Strigoi bloodline. For a Strigoi to allow a crypt ghoul's furted mouth to sink into its flesh is a sign that the vampire is truly desperate. Nonetheless, some ghoul kings encourage this strange and abhorrent practice. Once it has drunk the blood of a vampire, its eyes turn red and it goes into a killing frenzy. During this stage in its transformation, the crypt horror would pull down weaker members of its own pack, dragging its screeching prey into an open grave or a shattered tomb in order to consume its gruesome feast undisturbed. After finishing its cannibalistic orgy, the swollen ghoul will crawl back to its awaiting master, hoping for another draught of its vampiric blood. This transformation continues until, by the coming of the next full moon, the new crypt horror will have grown to several times its original size and ferocity, thanks to the unnatural blood of the vampire and the consumption of extraordinary amounts of flesh. They provide a tangible benefit to their Strigoi masters. True undead can be warded away from grave haunts by sacred sigils and priests of Mor. Typical crypt ghouls are too cowardly to mount a full-scale assault on such a place. Hence, Strigoi Ghoul Kings will create crypt horrors whenever they need to smash through formidable defenses. They are neither living nor truly dead, and as the call of Mor's realm pulls at what remains of their souls, they vent their rage upon the crypt gardens of the god of death. Because of this, the human gravekeepers of sepulchres and mausoleums fear crypt horrors above all other minions of the Ghoul Kings. Once the magical wards guarding the cemeteries are destroyed by the rampage of these foul beasts, their vampiric master is free to raid the corpse fields beyond. Though the lineage of Strigos has broken every taboo by creating them, they are able to gain power in this way. A crypt horror typically towers over its smaller ghoul brethren, and though it retains the characteristic stoop and loping gait of its former life, its sinews become hard as iron. Bony growths and protrusions push out from the creature's spine, and talons lengthen from splayed, dexterous hands. The potent dyad of tough ghoul flesh washed down with vampiric blood wreaks changes inside as well as outside. Though the crypt horror's freakish metabolism will soon drive the creature's body to consume itself, in the meantime, the fiend's constitution is such that it can re-knit even the most horrific wound with an effort of will. This is the main reason why the more elitist vampire cliques tolerate these foul monsters. Dark magic, the sustaining power of necromancy, literally runs in a crypt ghoul's veins, and therefore the sheer violence it can unleash is not to be underestimated. In battle, packs of crypt horrors muzzle their way towards the front lines, eyes glowing with dire light. They use shattered gravestones, tomb statuary and cemetery railings to smash aside those brave enough to stand before them. but it is their meat-encrusted fangs and talons that are to be avoided at all costs. Even a shallow wound from a crypt horror bears enough poisonous rot to kill a horse. Despised by the living and the dead alike, they are creatures to be truly feared. Wights are driven by a malign intelligence all their own, not the unquestioning allegiance of their lesser counterpart. Just as a powerful necromancer will someday die and rise again as an undead, all his vile powers intact, so too can the greatest of the warrior heroes. Many of them are truly ancient, the remnants of an aboriginal tribal people who once occupied the lands of the Empire thousands of years before it was so known. From Valdemar, a scholar of Nuln. The Grave Guard are the undead corpses of long-past heroes and warlords that have been arisen from their graves with a partial flicker of the original soul trapped within. The process of creating a wight allows them to fight the enemies of the necromancer that raised them with the skills and tools of their former life. On other occasions, wights are often arisen by their own means when the place of their rest, such as a tomb or mound, was desecrated by outside intruders, forcing the deceased spirit to be sucked into his former body by the dark magic that permeates from such an evil place. Although their bodies have decayed, leaving only bones and tattered flesh, a grave guard is held together by evil magic so strong that it has endured for centuries. They wear ancient battle gear of primitive alloy, corroded by time and dusty with the years. These eerie, silent sentinels stand constant vigil on the crumbling battlements of many Sylvanian castles, never resting and eternally ready to defend their vampire masters. When a vampire marches forth, his grave guard advance at the head of the undead host. They form a formidable core of warriors, using the skills and tools of their former life to their own advantage. In battle, the sheer resilience of the Grave Guard has become well known across the nations of humans, elves, and dwarfs. Their combination of stout shields, thick armor plates, and the natural resilience of the undead means that a simple sword blow has little chance of stopping them. Only with the most powerful blows from a weapon or the magical properties of spells and items could hope to pierce the dark magic that protects a grave guard in combat. In battle, the grave guards form the elite and disciplined core of an undead army, where they are considerably more durable than the typical skeleton warriors, yet far more disciplined than even the most docile Wargeist. As such, it is common to see the grave guards at close proximity to the vampire or necromancer that raised them. Throughout the cursed realm stand watchtowers of bone. Within are the grave guard, always on duty and ready to strike. Standing sentinel throughout Sylvania are watchtowers. At the top stand the vigilant grave guard, with yearning mouths always open and piercing red eyes that never close. The tower's inhabitants do not take such action just against the small folk, but any intruders and invaders that dare approach. They appear to cling to their undead status by sheer willpower. Their magic is irrelevant. Whatever petty dabblings they may have indulged in during their lives have clearly failed, or else they would still have a corporeal form. It is only their twisted spirits, racked with hatred and pain, that keeps them in this world at all, and only by the most tenuous threads. From Heinrich Maltz, a high priest of Verena. Can wraiths are hooded, spectral spirits of former necromancers or sorcerers that have used the corrupting influence of dark magic to extend their lives beyond the mortal limit, but at the price of losing one's own mortal body. Though their appearance may perceive it, these spirits are not servants of Mor, the Death God, in any way, for they have defied the Death God's authority by preventing the inevitability of their deaths and continuing to do so even in the afterlife. Afraid of the punishment that lies for them in the afterlife, these spirits would try all they can to cling to this fading world. Within the material world, these spirits are amongst the most dreaded of all undead. Lacking physical forms altogether, they cannot be put down by axe, sword, or hammer. Even the strongest faiths, such as exorcisms used by warrior priests, cannot banish such creatures easily. Worse still, the icy touch of a Cairn Wraith drains the warm essence of mortal men completely. It is capable of reaching into the body of an adversary and closing its freezing claws around the victim's vital organs, sending painful chills that kills the man instantly. Before the founding of the Colleges of Magic, men knew little about the magical arts. For thousands of years, there were tribal wise men, gifted seers, healers, astrologers, and hedge magicians who were viewed with suspicion, awe, or fear. Through a quirk of nature or mindset, these lucky few were able to use the winds of magic with relative safety. For most, the only magic that could be harnessed was unpredictable shamanism or difficult rituals. Many did not realize the inherent hazards of what they were doing. Slowly, the sorcery corrupted them, and as they became steeped in dark magic, these sorcerers learned to extend the span of their lives by decades, even centuries. Most of these seekers of immortality managed only to preserve their spirits, not their bodies. Decay took their mortal forms, rotting it away even as they sought desperately to sustain it. With no corporeal form to speak of, these sorcerers became wandering spirits, clad only in their death shrouds. As their grip on the world of mortals weakened, these vagrant souls were drawn to places of grief, where they lingered, feeding on the sorrow of mourners. Not truly alive, but unable to die, they became chilling shadows, caught between this world and the next as miserable spirits who hunger for the warmth and flesh of mortals. Bound in the mortal realm to tombs and burrows, swathed in robes of inky darkness, these spirits became Can Wraiths. So unnatural are they that their very presence fills the air with horror. Even the hardened soldiery of the Empire shivered at the mention of a Can Wraith sighting. Most folks that have actually set eyes upon them become crazed with fear long before they are killed. Though each wraith is possessed of a glimmering will, there are ancient rituals known to the eldest vampires that can call forth these unquiet spirits and bind them into an army. Only when the ritual is intoned backwards, syllable by syllable, are the Can Wraiths released back to the place of their death. The vampire counts purposefully bind these wraiths, willingly or not, to their service and use them as a form of near-invincible shock infantry. Accompanied by units of deathless warriors, these sinister spirits glide across the battlefield, tattered robes rippling in the etheric winds as arrows, bullets, and bolts pass harmlessly through them. Unhindered by cannonball or flame, the wraiths close in on their prey, seeking out and cutting down the enemy without so much as a whisper. The crippling fear that arises from having to fight a nigh unkillable, skith-wielding spectre can make even the bravest man flee the battlefield. Because they are impervious to physical weaponry, only the raw energies of magic or a well-placed blow from an enchanted weapon can slay a Can Wraith. It is perhaps a blessing, then, that the Can Wraiths are so few in numbers within the entirety of the old world. Spirit hosts are a common sight amongst the armies of the dead. A horde of ethereal ghosts that swarm across the battlefield where neither blade nor bullet can hit them. Across Sylvania, poltergeists and ghosts haunt peasants with dreadful groans and freezing touches, sometimes driving whole villages to be abandoned as a result. When the vampire counts go to war, these restless spirits are pulled along by the dark magic of the undead army. Insubstantial and impervious to mortal weapons, these angry ghosts swarm over the enemy, leeching energy from the living and leaving stark horror in their wake. Sylvania is rich in the spirits of the dead, for it has a long history of misery and suffering, and is rife with polluting warpstone. As well as animating the physical remains of the dead, This sorcerous energy also has an effect on the souls of the departed. When Vlad von Karstein cast out the priests of Mor, wardens of the dead, he ensured that the spirits of those who had died could not pass into the afterlife. Since then, the unquiet spirits can often be seen as mournful, swirling mists through which protrude mournful, wailing faces and grasping hands. Their touch draws some of a victim's soul into the underworld, dragging them into a waking nightmare or stealing their knowledge of who they are. Only a priest of Mor can restore the mind of one who has had his spirit drained by a ghost, and survivors of the process are rare. All the peoples of the Empire share a common view of what happens to the souls of the dead. They pass into the underworld, the land of Mor, the god of death. Priests of Mor and wizards of the Amethyst College have been known to contact a soul in the underworld and remind it of its former life, strengthening the soul's grip on its memories. The mortal can then commune with that spirit and learn of things that have passed and things that are yet to pass. The Empire citizens also believe that sometimes Mor will close the gates of the underworld and forbid a spirit from entering. He may do this if it is not that individual's time to pass beyond the veil, for instance, or the person has sworn an oath that they have not yet fulfilled. These souls burn brightly in the underworld and disturb the other spirits, and so Mor banishes them back to the realm of the living, condemning them to a shade-like existence until their duty is done. It is these tortured spirits that can be called forth by the necromantic power of a vampire, channeling dark magic so that the roaming ghosts can manifest themselves. Necromancers must undergo a stranger process still to bind the souls of men, sending their own spirits to the underworld of Mor. Once there, they can steal a few souls, snatching them from under the gaze of the god of the dead. However, sometimes Mor catches these interlopers, imprisoning them for eternity. Their body falls into a catatonic state, and then slowly rots away, while their soul suffers anguish without end. On the field of battle, these vengeful apparitions cluster together into hosts that drift slowly towards their warm-blooded victims with terrible inevitability. Even a cannonball strike will not damage a spirit host, for they only partially exist in this world. However, their twilight state does anything but render these spirits harmless. The ghost of a cursed man can claw at the mortal's flesh with long, taloned hands, stilling the victim's beating heart with a touch, and killing him outright, even as his eyes widen in shock. Warbeasts are the darkness within a vampire's soul made manifest. They are towering winged humanoids, each several times the size of a man. Though the Warbeasts once walked and talked as lords amongst the chattel, these curse-born vampires have devolved into ravening predators, desperate for the taste of blood. They prowl the battlefield in packs, ready to pounce upon the least sign of weakness, and tear a hole in the enemy ranks with crimson claw and bloody fang. The creation of a Warbeast is a strange metamorphosis that takes place far from the eyes of mortals. Under the extensive castles of the von Carsteins are vast subterranean networks of basements, galleries, and dining halls, with vaulted ceilings that stretch into the pitch darkness above. This realm of former glories is where the Warbeast dark birth takes place. Once these haunted halls were places of grandeur and largesse, the sites of sinister speeches, flesh banquets, and epic displays of privilege. Now, they are little more than antique graveyards filled with the detritus of an ancient aristocracy. Moth-eaten drapes and tapestries hang like curtains of moss from the damp-raddled walls. Embroidered rugs and mosaics of bone are hidden by inches of tainted and brackish water that seeps through from the cursed lands above. Broken harpsichords lean drunkenly against the cloth-bound statuary of ancient gods. Shattered coaches and rot-gnawed sedan chairs are heaped amongst haunted portraits and magical relics stolen from conquered civilizations. Within the mounds of priceless bric-a-brac, chain-bound coffins and sculpted sarcophagi nestle like chrysalises in a rotting woodpile. If a chance visitor were to approach these coffins and blow away the carpet of dust upon them, the name von Carstein could just about be made out, chiseled in Baroque letters upon elaborate stone scrollwork. Not all of these coffins are empty, for this hidden realm is where the von Carsteins lock away those of their family who have fallen out of favor. Those who come off worse in the endless power struggles of the vampires often find themselves prematurely buried or left at the mercy of their own relentless thirsts. Slowly, over the course of decades, the constantly dripping water, magically tainted by warp stone in the stalactites overhead, finds its way into the prisons of these unfortunates. Torpid for want of fresh blood, the slumbering vampires begin to devolve and change shape, growing larger and more bestial as the diluted dark magic swirling around them lends them a terrible strength. Whilst the transformation from humanoid into monster takes hold, the muscular Warbeast will crack open its stone prison with great effort. Casting aside its chains, the creature unfolds its leathery wings and rears up into the darkness, letting loose a terrible scream of rage and betrayal that sends great swarms of bats whirling throughout the cavernous chambers. the shattered remnants of its sarcophages fall away, and the name and personality of its former incumbent is left behind in the mire. The newborn Wargeist begins to hunt, desperate to sink its teeth into mortal veins. At the first taste of blood, the transformation is made permanent. What was once a proud lord of the dead is forever cursed to an existence as a ravening beast. Though each Wargeist emerges from its prison far stronger in body, it is invariably weaker in mind. After centuries of thirsty confinement, all they really want to do is feed. These creatures are easily bound to their jailer's will as a result, and are sent into battle in packs in order to feast on those enemies foolish enough to stay too far from the sanctuary of the main battle line. Wargeists make formidable fighters, for their raw fury and terrible hunger is undiminished by the control exerted by their cruel, vampiric masters. And now, the most famous of the Wargeists, the Devils of Schwarzhafen. No longer vampires, but fighting with the same insane savagery. From the once proud Carstein Devils themselves. The winged horrors known to the peasantry of Sylvania as the Devils of Schwarzhafen are not, in fact, a breed of beast unto their own right. Instead, they are devolved vampires, captured by the most powerful of their number and twisted by dark magic into a form that better echoes the foulness in their souls. The Devils of Schwarzhafen were once handsome sons of the von Carstein dynasty, each sired by one of Manfred's brothers in darkness. Though young, this coterie made for a significant part of the von Carstein power base, where one vampiric whelp might be put in his place easily enough. Three of their kind united proved a threat even to the likes of Conrad the Bloody. So it was that the Carstein Devils, as these youngbloods called themselves, rode out the turbulent times of old. Manfred barely survived the vampire wars. By the time he had recovered from his defeat at Helfen, the Carstein Devils had spread their influence across the Vale. The Count felt that his presumptuous nephews needed to learn their place. Tracking them down during the hours of daylight, he bound each one into his coffin using a Nehekaren mortuary rite. For many years, they lay trapped in the caverns below Castle Schwarzhafen, their forms slowly distorted by the warp stone-tainted water swilling around their sarcophagi. The beasts that Manfred eventually released from the coffins were physically horrific and had no trace of intellect. Now, the Devils of Schwarzhafen haunt the night at Manfred's behest, falling like vast hunting bats on his enemies and ripping them to bloody rags as their master looks on in amusement. Vargulfs. are those powerful yet devolved vampire lords that have since succumbed themselves willingly to their most primal urges, turning their once human bodies into a creature larger and far more powerful in body but weaker in mind. Within every vampire soul lurks a slavering monster, driven to feed on the blood of the living time and time again. Most vampires seek control over this side of their existence, clinging to the trappings of aristocracy, privilege, or in some extreme cases, a debased form of martial honor. Yet, not all vampires care for the trappings of mortal life, or seek to control their inner urges. There are a few vampires who allow the animalistic hunter within them to consume their personality completely. These feral predators abandon their citadels in order to run unfettered through the forest, hunting at the head of packs of dire wolves or even stranger beasts. Those who revel in such behavior become physically changed beyond recognition by the vampiric curse. Hence are born the creatures known to the peasant folk as the Wargulfs. Over the centuries, these most devolved of vampires become blood-mad killers that exist only to feed. Like enraged, starved beasts, they run rampant, devouring whole villages and yet never sating their thirst. They slaughter without mercy, luxuriating in bloody carnage, as well as devouring the living. A Wargulf will ransack graves and feast upon the bodies of the dead. Other vampires consider them no better than ghoul kin, though the terrible changes wrought by their surrender to the rage within make them deadly in battle. A Wargulf has a monstrous body, swollen by a constant diet of red meat. Unbound by human form, a Wargulf is a contorted mass of packed muscle, giving it the strength to crush a chariot or bowl over entire ranks of those stupid enough to try and pen it in. Powerful legs and broad wing flaps allow Wargulfs to chase down their kills in swift, gliding leaps, and they can lash out at enemies around them with shocking speed. They use their immense claws to strip flesh from bone, the better to suck at the juicy marrow of their prey. A Wargulf's main weapon, however, is a wide mouth filled with dagger-like fangs capable of puncturing armor and crushing skulls. In battle, the Wargulf becomes a whirlwind of rage. Though voracious and unpredictable killers, they are far from mindless. They do not possess the aptitude or inclination for sorcery of their vampiric cousins, but their presence still acts as a conduit for dark magic, and they are able to re-knit themselves with the raw stuff of necromancy should they suffer injury. Pack animals will instinctively follow them, recognizing the apex predator in their midst. Crypt ghouls in particular are drawn to Vargulfs, recognizing something of their own unwholesome nature in the massive beasts. Hence, the caverns of the Strigoi Ghoul Kings often play host to a Vargulf or two. On occasion, they will become the leader of their own pack of crypt ghouls, sharing their lair with a loathsome court of flesh-eaters. From a secret cave or decrepit mausoleum, the Vargulf leads its gruesome attendants in midnight hunts that always end in the slaughter of the living. For their part, the crypt ghouls gain a powerful protector, something the cowardly creatures value highly. Though the hidden armies of ghoul kin that lurk in the catacombs of the world prefer to skulk and hide than to wage open war, when they boil out of the darkness, a Vargulf's presence can be the difference between victory and defeat. Go not to the mounds on moonless nights, seek not the dead to rise, risk not the wrath that sleeps and dreams, heed the words of the wise. The chorus from a traditional Empire peasant song. Black Knights are the horrific reanimated corpses of long-dead tribal chieftains and primeval knights who were raised from their resting place by necromancers and vampires. In the times before the Empire, there were few domesticated horses, and horsemen were exceedingly rare. In most tribes, a steed was a symbol of wealth and status. So it was often that only a chieftain and his closest warriors would ride mounted into battle. The wealthiest of their number, clad in crude iron plate and carrying stout shields. When these early knights died, their horses were ritually killed and buried in the burrows alongside their masters so that they may carry their deceased master into the afterlife. Many centuries later, the vampire counts are known to summon forth the gruesome remains of these ancient knights in order to bolster the ranks of lesser undead minions under their control. As a vampire stalks through burrows and mausoleums, dark magic swirls invisibly around him like a cloak, probing and penetrating the cracked and overgrown porticos of each resting place and saturating the bones of the armored corpses within. Without the blessings of Mor to protect them, these corpses are at the mercy of the vampire. 1,000 years of dust shifts and dissipates as the parchment-dry skeletal corpses twitch and sit upright. In a morbid mockery of their old lives, these black knights stir into motion. Alongside them, the skeletal remains of their steeds jerk to unlife as well, twisted by magic into hellish mockeries of the noble beasts they once were. Outside the burrow, the vampire would then split open the resting place of his new servants with a deafening crack. At his word, fully formed black knights ride pell-mell from the tumble-down ruins of their tombs. Whole units of warrior horsemen arrayed in the corroded armor of a bygone age. When called into battle, Black Knights would often form into squadrons of powerful shock cavalry. During their mortal lives, these unearthly knights used weapons bearing enchantments of destruction. Though corrupted by the patina of the ages, these tools of slaughter are no less potent than when the wielder was a man of flesh and blood. It is said that once someone is pierced by a Black Knight's lance or sword, the wound it creates would never recover. As well as enchanted weapons, the Black Knight's steeds are said to be trapped between worlds due to the ritual that binds the steed to its master. As such, there have been reports of Black Knights galloping straight through the rubble of ruined cities, or even charging across the surface of a lake without leaving so much as a ripple. With these advantages, these unliving cavaliers would then crush themselves headlong into the ranks of their still living enemies, spitting their foes on lances wreathed in cold flame, and lashing out with heavy swords older than the Empire itself. There are armor-clad vampire knights in the world, pursuing their martial glories with deathless vigor. Most famous are the Blood Dragons, but not all the deadly horsemen of the old world were trained within Blood Keep. The vampiric Blood Knights, also known as the Vampire Knights, are among the most fearsome cavalry in all of the old world, first created by the mightiest vampire, Aborage. In Britonia, there is a breed of vampire that shares many of the characteristics of the aristocratic breed, though by no means are they contained by the borders of that foolish land. They are warriors, dedicated to perfecting their craft and exulting in the power vampirism affords. Single-minded in their intensity, they are bold, arrogant, and thoroughly vicious. From Maximilian Summers, a knight of the Empire. Their training and discipline in life is enhanced by the unnatural speed and strength of the vampiric curse. Blood Knights are nigh indestructible, riding with fangs bared through storms of arrow and shot. Such is their honor that they can refuse no martial challenge, and will fight at the forefront of an undead army without question. It is said that even the fabled Grail Knights of Britonia cannot match the Blood Knight's lance for lance upon the field. Nevertheless, such beings are deadly anathema to the creatures of the night, and simply being near them can induce great pain and weakness. A Blood Knight's armor is encrusted with images of death and slaughter. Their blades are fell weapons, inscribed with dark runes, chased with precious metals, and fashioned in the likeness of evil beasts. The knights do not ride mortal steeds, but charge across the field upon evil nightmares that are clad in thick barding painted with disturbing icons of necromantic power. To Blood Knights, every human in the world can be broken down into two categories: a worthy opponent or a training dummy. The only time a Blood Knight might show mercy is if he encountered an opponent who has great potential to one day be a worthy opponent. It may be better to let such a mortal become something interesting rather than snuff him out with the rest of the vermin. Despite their aloof nature and singular obsession, they sometimes attract followers. If a Blood Knight finds fame with his particular approach to the quest, or a devastating new combat style, others may flock to imitate and learn. So it is that new orders spring up or take root in already existing orders or organizations. The infamous Red Duke of Aquitaine was such a creature, beginning as a lone knight, but ending up with an entire army at his command, both mortal and immortal, as word of his martial skills spread across Britannia. The Knights of Irana were a mortal order of Estalian knights until their Grand Master concluded that the techniques of Aborash far outstripped those of Myrmidia and brought his whole unit into the darkness to join him. And there are many more such groups, small and large. The rest are lone hunters, renegades and vagabond knights who roam the old world alone and unaided. Sometimes they are found guarding remote bridges or fords, testing all who would cross in mortal combat. Others live an austere existence in high mountain fortresses or secret caves, perhaps training those who have the tenacity to seek them out, or perhaps just killing them for food. Alternatively, they may hide amongst humans, mixing with the noble classes, or slipping amongst the ranks of knightly or monastic orders. A Blood Knight will be anyone, as long as it allows him to practice his swordplay and feed when needed. It is not uncommon to find a Blood Knight brotherhood housed within the stronghold of a vampire lord. Among the dread towers and gargoyles of Sylvania's castles are its keeps, the sanctuaries from where a lord will entertain his allies or unworthy mortals, and make his fell plans for domination of the living. The midnight aristocracy are of noble stock, and so enjoy doing what nobles tend to do: entertain and plot. And now, onto the most notable Blood Knight orders. The Blood Dragons, the most infamous order of Blood Knights, were easily the Order of the Blood Dragon. Centuries ago, the people of the Empire would have named the Knights of the Order of the Blood Dragon among the noblest of warriors defending their lands. Their great fortress, Blood Keep, guarded the passes to Britannia, and was famed for the strength of its walls and the valor of its defenders. Then, the Drakenhove Templars. The original Drakenhove Templars were a genuine knightly order, founded long before Otto von Drac was usurped by Vlad von Carstein. They had the noble goal of driving the darkness out of Sylvania. Needless to say, they failed, and Conrad von Carstein himself tore the last Grand Master apart hundreds of years before the end times. There were several iterations of the order, for Vlad and his heirs were ever imitators of human tradition, and the most recent incarnation of the Order was comprised of vampires considered unworthy to bear the von Carstein name. The Order was considered to be the greatest outside of the Blood Keep itself. The Knights of the Red Death. None were more bloodthirsty or more merciless than the Knights of the Red Death. These vampiric fiends were the butchers behind the massacre of Modruin and the slaughter of every living soul in the siege of the walled town of Ostwald. The vampire Gorgivich Krakvald rode at the fore of these knights, and their standard was emblazoned with a representation of Krakvald Castle. The Death Guard. The Blood Knights of the Sea are elite, armor-clad sentries to the dreaded seafaring creatures of the night. They act as elite infantry troops within the undead fleet of the vampire pirate Luthor Harkon. The Seneschals, each a fearsome dark champion in their own right. These knights were the ancient protectors of Duke Merovech of Mousillon, clad in archaic, serrated plate armor and wielding powerful weapons of darkness. Their deeds were immortalized on murals across Mousillon. Many of these fearsome warriors were slain by the Grail Knight, Kalar of Garamond, along with their Dark Master. The Knights of the Black Grail. A mysterious group of Black Knights who replaced the Seneschals, acting as the personal knights of Malobod during the Bretonnian Civil War. They are not to be confused with the more infamous Black Grail Knights. And at last, the Knights of Irana. Originally a mortal order of Istalian knights dedicated to Myrmidia. This changed when their Grand Master concluded that the martial techniques of Aborash far outstripped those taught to the knights by the cult of Myrmidia. In search of this superiority, the Grand Master of the Knights of Irana brought his whole order willingly into the eternal darkness of undeath to join him in the search for true perfection. And at last, the most notable and legendary Blood Knights to have ever existed. First up, the Red Duke, also known as the Scourge of Aquitaine. He was a former Duke of Aquitaine, initially slain by King Louis the Righteous. He returned centuries later to defile his former dukedom. Then Malobod, the bastard son of King Louis Leoncoeur and the self-appointed Duke of Mousillon, and, of course, Conrad von Carstein, the insane and bloody executioner of Vlad von Carstein, who later rose to lead Sylvania against the Empire. The Blood Knights are nigh indestructible, and their thirst for blood makes them ferocious and implacable. There are few tales to tell of their existence, for those who see them often die of fright, or worse, find themselves skewered on a wicked lance and hauled into the air before the fangs of the waiting Blood Knight. You can fight them, and it's a struggle not to flee in horror from them. You just have to hope your commander and his champions really are the holy knights they aspire to be, and that maybe they'll be able to hurt the creatures. From Alphonse, a Bretonnian man-at-arms. Hex race, also known as the Reaper Knights, are a type of wraith, ethereal spirits born from the depths of the underworld, sent forth into the world of the living to hunt down those evil men who would dare to defy their fate and the will of the Death God. The first sightings of the Hex race are shrouded in mystery, but it is said that they are created on the cursed night of Hexensnacht, the first day of the new year, tearing their way into the mortal realm from the bowels of the underworld. The Hex race shade-like existence leaves it with a hunger that only the sucker of a damned soul can sate. Once the curse of the Hex race has been laid upon their prey, there can be no escape. The spectral horsemen can hurtle across rivers and pass through mountainsides on their incorporeal steeds without slowing their headlong charge. Ironically, however, in their rush to hunt down these damned souls, they would inevitably become lured into a trap from which a powerful necromancer will bind these servants of the Death God into his will. They are able to move from the realm of spirits to the mortal world and back again at will. They share many similarities with Can race, though they are not bound to places of death and grief, but instead are able to roam freely. The Skith-like weapons they use to slay their prey would be lethal enough in the material realm, but because the Hex wraiths shimmer between worlds, their spirit skiths are able to pass through Gromril armor or scaled dragon hide without hindrance. A single blow from a spirit skith can snatch away a mortal's essence whilst leaving his physical form completely unharmed. It is these strange weapons that earn the Hex race their nickname of the Reaper Knights, for they harvest the souls of the living just as a farmer reaps his crop. A soul taken by it does not dissipate altogether, but it is instead absorbed by the spectre that took it. These dread reapers hence burn with flickering flame, all that is left of the horrified spirits they have stolen from the mortal realm. The arcane bloodline of the Necrarchs were the first to bind them into their armies. Some say they've learned the art of their summoning from the stolen book of Arcan, while others say that the legendary Melchior was the first to master their control. In recent years, however, they have been seen in undead armies from all across the known world. When bound into a vampire's service and commanded by their Hell-Wraith leaders to ride into battle, whole packs of these apparitions hurtle across the field, plunging headlong through the swiftly dwindling ranks of the foe. In recent years, The vampires of Sylvania have learned to bind these creatures of shadow to their service, using them as weapons of war. The sight of a pack of cackling hex race approaching fast, spirits gifts held high, and unnatural soul fires flickering from their eye sockets is enough to chill the blood of even the most seasoned warrior and send them fleeing. Able to glide through all physical obstacles, whether it would be stone, fire, or flesh, these hex race could not be defeated by simple mortal weapons. It is only with faith and the use of magical spells and items that one would have any chance of harming a hex wraith in combat. It is small wonder that these deathly riders are amongst the most feared of all the minions of the vampire counts. The vampire warbeasts. First on the list are the dire wolves. It is written in certain scrolls that the dire wolf and the giant wolf are two separate species, but I subscribe to a different view. Giant wolves are clearly chaos-tainted, though so long ago that they have since become almost entirely natural creatures. Dire wolves, on the other hand, I have been studying the writings of Orthin the Old, who in his quintessential treatise on Sylvanian fauna seems to suggest that the body of the giant wolf rises from the accursed earth after burial, having been transformed into the undead dire wolf. From Valdemar, a scholar of Nuln. The dire wolves are macabre parodies of the living giant wolves that roam the Badlands and the forests of the old world. Their flesh hangs in tatters from cracking bones, their skulls and innards exposed through tears in their skin. They are swathed in an eerie, glimmering twilight, and their eyes glow with unnatural energy. The stench of putrefaction hangs on their wet breath, and their howls cause shivers of fear to freeze the bold. When they are slain, their bodies dissolve into a coiling miasma, leaving nothing behind. The lands of the Eastern Empire are plagued by the giant wolves that emerge in winter from lairs high in the World's Edge Mountains. Driven by a ravenous hunger, they descend to the foothills in large packs, attacking farms and villages and preying on travelers. The men of the Empire hunt these beasts mercilessly, but this only serves to keep their numbers in check and their voracious attacks at bay for a short time. In the blighted lands of Sylvania, the corpses of these wolves must be burned or buried deeply, for those that are not will return from the dead and continue the hunt. Even when the correct precautions are taken, and the bodies of these monstrous predators are buried in deep pits, dark magic can still gather and resurrect them. Half rotten, their fur matted with blood and grime, the animated carcasses claw and wriggle up through the earth in order to hunt again. Maggots writhe in open wounds, and charred skin hangs from their bones in ragged flaps. dire wolves are the hunting hounds of the vampires, and their senses are as keen as they were in life. They gather in great packs around the castles and towers of the undead lords of Sylvania, their mournful howls echoing for miles across the still night. When the princes of undeath make war upon the living, the dire wolves follow, treating the vampire as their pack leader. In battle, the dire wolves often lope along the flanks of the undead army, driving away enemy cavalry and leaping on small, vulnerable regiments or war machine crews. Vampires sometimes keep the largest of these creatures in pens deep below their castles and towers, feeding them on local peasants until they are large and glutted, then goading them to new heights of viciousness. The vampires imbue their creations with dark magic to increase vitality and bestow a callous cunning. These monstrous creations are known as Doom Wolves, and it is these larger, more ferocious beasts that lead the dire wolf packs to war. Next, almost in the same category as the dire wolves, the fell bats. With a body as long as a grown man, fell bats are a fearsome sight. They are darker than midnight and silent as death, even when in full flight. In fact, the only noises that a fell bat makes on the hunt are horrible gobbling slurps when it sinks its distended mouth into living flesh. In truth, a fell bat bears as much resemblance to an ordinary bat as a maddened lion does to a domestic cat. Those who have encountered them and lived tell how they hunt with unerring accuracy, swooping down to knock knights from their saddles or pick off lone warriors unawares. Vampires view them much as a Bretonnian lord might his prized hunting falcons. Precious sweetmeats are offered to fell bats from the ramparts of the vampire's fortress, but to harness an entire flock, a grander sacrifice must be made. A fresh victim, belly slit and screaming, or a terrified messenger sent to run into the night with his eyes put out, is more to their taste. Once they have the scent of gore, they will fall upon the enemy battle line with bloodthirsty intent. And next up, the dark and twisted parody of the Imperial Griffin, the Terrorgeist. I have seen them at night, flapping their mighty wings across the moon. They call to me, tell me I will join them soon. Herr Dr. Leberknudel says that I am crazy, but I know that it's not true. They will carry me off to my new home, and we will dance round the moon together. Oh yes. From Rudy, a great Altdorf asylum inmate. The Terrorgeist is the largest and most ferocious bat species to have ever existed. So large and terrifying that they've grown to the size of dragons. In the hidden reaches of Sylvania, these titanic bats soar out from their caves to hunt horses, caravans and pegasi under the sickly skies. It is the ambush tactic of the creatures that give them their truly terrifying reputation. Its vision is poor, so the swooping monstrosity ensures that its prey is rendered motionless by emitting a piercing shriek so loud and unexpected it can stun even a Bretonnian warhorse into paralysis. At that precise moment, the Terrorgeist will dive down, gather up both rider and mount in its talons, and return to its lair to glut itself on the warm blood of its victims. It is the mortal remains of these troglodytic beasts that the ghoul kings of the caverns bind to their service. The binding process comes easily to these reclusive vampires, for Strigoi ghoul kings and Terrorgeists have much in common. As dark magic swirls around the monstrous cave creature, a bond of blood is formed between master and beast. Much like any other creature that drinks from a ghoul king's veins, Terrorgeists have necromantic power running in their blood that can heal even the most severe of wounds. In death, it becomes a nightmare made real. Guided by its master's will, the monstrosity creaks through the clouds above the battlefield on blotch-skinned pinions, its rotten flesh and withered organs open to the night air. It is the deathly shriek of an unliving Terrorgeist that is perhaps its most fearsome aspect. As the magics of undeath are worked upon the beast, its cry is transformed from a simple but shockingly loud noise into a barrage of eldritch power. Some say its shriek is nothing less than the screams of the damned, channeled directly from the realm of chaos. It matters little to its prey, for so devastating is its sonic attack that it can cause a man to die of fright in an instant. By venting this noise as it dives down upon its prey, it can cripple an enemy regiment moments before it slams into the reeling survivors, slaughtering the rest with disease-ridden tooth and claw. Even when the Terrorgeist is slain, these creatures have a violent tendency to explode upon their deaths. Due to their ferocity, the Terrorgeists are a highly favorable mount amongst many undead factions. And next, and of course, one can never forget the zombie dragon. Zombie dragons are the reanimated corpses of long-dead dragons that were raised from their resting place within the Plane of Bones by the use of powerful dark magic. The Plane of Bones is a harsh and lifeless landscape of multicolored sand and tainted rock located to the east of the World's Edge Mountains, from which protrude huge rib cages of ancient, primeval dragons. This is the place where dragons of ancient times once came to die, to rest their bones amongst those of their ancestors as they had done for millions of years before any other sentient beings walked the world. Here lies the bones of the great ancestral dragons. Skulls the size of castle towers lie mingled with leg bones larger than the mast of an imperial warship. These bones date from the ancient days of the draconic race. Though today's dragons are of a lesser breed, they are still incomparably mightier than other races of the world. However, following the arrival of chaos, the plane of bones has since become saturated with large amounts of dark magic. This magic eventually contaminated the remains of these dragons, forcing them to rise once more as the first zombie dragons. Ever since then, vampires and powerful necromancers of all kinds have been known to take a pilgrimage to this ancient landscape where they pick through one amongst many dragon remains. Once he finds a suitable corpse, the vampire or necromancer who used the excess dark magic that contaminates the land to resurrect the dragon back to life as his eternal combat mount. These once majestic creatures stagger upright once more with a great despairing roar before stooping to allow their new master to ride atop their powerful shoulders. Animated by dark magic, a zombie dragon is borne aloft by great tattered wings, its body covered with thick, withered hide. Though in life it once breathed fire capable of melting steel, a zombie dragon can only belch forth a cloud of pestilent gas which strips flesh from bones and corrodes armor. Its claws and sword-like teeth remain as deadly as they ever were, and is still capable of ripping an armored knight in half and swallowing his war horse in one motion. When such a monster is used as a steed by a powerful vampire lord, even the greatest heroes quail before the raw might of undeath. For the combined might of vampire and his undead dragon is enough to break the back of any army sent against them. Wreathed in a fog of rots and surrounded by swarms of blood-hungry flies, a zombie dragon can turn the tide of a battle purely by dint of its horrific presence. I thought there were few pleasures left in the world that I had not already experienced. Certainly none that were worth expanding any effort towards. I must confess, though, to the great thrill I felt when I first bound Agorak the Silent to my will. As delicious as it was, it paled in comparison to the joy I felt when I finally had the opportunity to unleash him on my enemies. Nothing quite like a dragon to put fear into the hearts of men. So much better if he's undead. From Constantine von Carstein, a vampire lord. And then, at last, the living personification of a nightmare. The Abyssal Terrors. The Abyssal Terrors, also known as the Winged Nightmares, is a term given to a wide variety of terrifyingly powerful monsters, living or undead, that serve as a combat mount for only the most warlike vampires. Some of these monsters are creatures of chaos, born from the mountains, the resurrected hybrids of rapacious beasts, or resurrected monsters that were given life with the use of necromancy. others are nightmarish creations that were given bodies of writhing blood and flayed skin thanks to the use of science and dark magic. The most common of these variants are generally winged creatures. Most abyssal terrors are inevitably born to war on ragged wings, allowing their undead masters to strike at the heart of the enemy army. The latter-day von Carsteins, for their part, were known for their use of a huge wolf-headed variant with slavering jaws and leathery wings. The exposed spinal columns and bony tails of this particular mount oozed with a numbing poison that drew all warmth from those it infected. Other than being forced into servitude, when a powerful necromancer or vampire wishes to create an abyssal terror of his own, the creation process has more to do with the unholy combination of mad science and dark sorcery than in any natural process. The most talented of the vampires that create them, such as the Hidden Brotherhood of the Necrarchs, draw a twisted amusement from such blasphemous births. They use parts harvested from a variety of monsters, fusing bone with ragged muscles and sinew together. Their vile creation is finally given animus when Moor's Leap is at its fullest, and a portion of that cyclopean moon's power is invested in the beast as it lurches and twitches upright. With its birth, the creature is forever bound to the will of his undead master. Join me next time for the mighty and all-powerful vampire war machines. Welcome to the list of all the vampire war machines. First on the list is the oh-so-common corpse card, though one should not underestimate its potential. A corpse card acts as a magnet for dark magic, drawing their power from the land itself and using said power in either bolstering the combat abilities of nearby undead or to raise them back into battle. Sometimes a corpse card is hung with a great bell, the clapper of which is a fell lodestone of eldritch provenance. When necromantic magic is thick in the air, the bell tolls and ripples of dark magic emanate from the corpse card. Under the influence of this ominous knell, the dead are drawn back together and cadavers stagger to their feet. Other corpse carts are lit by braziers that burn with supernatural flames. The smoke from these bale fires contains particles of warpstone that have the horrific ability of driving enemy wizards temporarily insane. The first corpse cards came about during the year of 1111 IC, when the Chaos Moon, Morsleep, showered down great chunks of warpstone meteorites upon the lands of Sylvania. The citizens of Sylvania during that time were racked with the horrors of the Black Plague, a powerful disease unleashed by the vermins of the Skaven Under Empire, in an effort to weaken the Empire of Man before their inevitable surface invasions. when fragments of warp stone were scattered all across Sylvania. The bodies of these victims became imbued with large amounts of dark magic. The warpstone meteors would, in time, also affect the plague wagons that carried the thousands of dead plague victims to the charnel pits. Bodies fused together into writhing undead masses, and the drivers of the carts changed into strange, withered creatures. The infamous necromancer Frederick Van Hal formed an army of the undead from the newly arisen, using his dark magic to bind the corpse carts to his will. Infused with warpstone and driven forth by Van Hal's will, the corpse carts acted as a conduit for the necromancer's magic. When Van Hal's apprentice turned on his master and killed him, the corpse carts were no longer controlled. Without Van Hal's guiding influence, the devilish chariots dispersed to all corners of Sylvania. Though most were hunted down and put to the torch, for over 1,000 years, the remaining corpse carts have wandered along the back roads and dirt tracks of Sylvania, carrying death and misery with them like a shroud. On dark nights, they enter ramshackle villages, stirring the dead in their graves and filling the dreams of slumbering peasants with visions of rot and death. These strange constructs are highly valued by all vampires, for undead creatures near a corpse cart will be imbued with large amounts of dark magic, giving the undead the ability to fight with an almost uncommon, frantic vigor and savagery. Next, the Black Coaches. The Black Coaches are, as their name suggests, coaches that are painted jet black and driven by the servants of the undead. Driven forward by a pair of nightmares and a skiff-wielding wraith, these coaches serve as a way of transporting a vampire anywhere he wishes, protecting him from the baneful sun and plowing through any opposition that would dare to stand in its way. These morbid carriages are omens of disaster and death. They are horrific, unholy things, neither wholly real nor immaterial. A black coach is a herald of famine, war, and murder, the sight of which can drive a sane man to suicide and cause families to fall upon themselves. They serve as the principal transport for vampires to cross large tracts of land without having to face the baneful rays of the sun. They also serve to transport the remains of vampires into places of slaughter, for a vampire can never truly die, and can still be resurrected should all his remains be placed in a casket and sent to places saturated with death magic. By creating a black coach, the vampire's retainers can transport their master's rejuvenating form to places of slaughter. This allows the vampire to revivify himself, drinking in the coalescing energies that swirl around the crucible of war. Each black coach is a magnet for such baleful forces. As it drives onward, it soaks the energies of the battlefield, shimmering with sorcerer's power until it is all but unstoppable. Driven on by the undying will of the vampire crouched within it, the black coach crushes or skiffs down the ranks of the enemy that are foolish enough to stand in its way. You have seen the black coach? You are lucky then. Some say the coach is driven by demons. I have heard it passes by here on Geheimnisnacht every year. Some say it carries wee children from Alterdorf who are sacrificed at the Dark Stone Ring from a Reichwald innkeeper during the night of Geheimnisnacht Eve. Next, the frankly ridiculously luxurious Coven Thrones. The Coven Thrones are large, exquisitely luxurious thrones that bear a coven of vampires across the battlefield, borne aloft by the departed spirits of those slain by the vampire. Compensating for a cursed existence with grandeur and luxury is a common theme amongst the vampire elite. A true lord or lady of undeath refuses to churn through the mud of a battlefield like a common peasant, or be content with the dubious dignity of sitting astride a grave beast. Instead, the monarchs of the night are often borne to war on glided palanquins known as the Coven Thrones. These bone frame constructs are held aloft by the departed spirits of those who have fallen in love with their owners and got nothing in return but a violent death. Mortal men shiver in awe-struck belief at the exotic beauty of the handmaidens lounging upon these Coven Thrones, hypnotized by a beguiling glance, a kiss upon the air, or a subtle finger beckoning them into eternal servitude. The legend of the vampires originates in the desert realm of Lahmia, and it is the Lahmians who are famed above all for their use of Coven Thrones. Those who hail from that land consider themselves the first amongst the aristocracy of the night, for their darkling city was the first ever to bear the curse of vampirism. All Lahmians descended from Neferata, the Queen of Mysteries, who is said to despise men with a passion. Consequently, very few Lahmians are male. Instead, the most enchantingly beautiful maidens are chosen from amongst the noble families of Bretonnia and the Empire and granted the blood kiss. They then gain control of the humans around them with cunning and intrigue, for Lahmians take an active interest in human affairs. No one knows how many eccentric noblewomen, widows, and high-born ladies are, in truth, members of the undead. The Lahmians are hedonistic, self-indulgent creatures that take great pains to present themselves in splendor and majesty at all times. Thus the Coven Thrones that carry the Lahmian sisterhood are bedecked with rare artifacts and strewn with silk-embroidered cushions and other finery. Over the centuries, the Lahmians have become skilled in the arts of foretelling and prescience in order to stay one step ahead of the agents who pursue them. The Coven Thrones bear great enchanted bowls full of fresh virgin's blood, within which the vampires' handmaidens can scry the future. What the Lahmians' final purpose is, however, none can fathom. Despite their luxury, these ostentatious palanquins are potent weapons upon the battlefield. The vampires themselves move so swiftly as to be virtually invisible to the eye, but their true strength lies in their unity. A coven of vampires fighting as one is as formidable a prospect as any dragon or demon lord. And at last, the most evil and powerful vampire war machine they have to offer, the Mortis Engine. The Mortis Engine is a horrific magical artifact that irradiates strongly with dark magic and is kept afloat by a horde of vengeful spirits. Within the Mortis Engine are powerful relics that are saturated with strong amounts of dark magic, such as the remains of powerful necromancers and liege lords of ancient times. Mortis engines are almost always watched over by deathless attendants known as corpse masters, trusted servants of the vampire counts, whom have proven immune to the dire energies that emanate from the relics within. When the corpse master removes the locks and opens the lead-lined reliquary, the deadly artifact within can be held aloft, leeching enemies' life energy away and invigorating any nearby undead creatures. The longer a battle rages, the more energies the relic absorbs, and the more powerful it becomes. Mortis engines can typically be found where the fighting is thickest, ominously drifting into bloody battle lines. Such positions simultaneously fuel the engine with the energies of the dying and allow the engine to support undead forces where the fighting is thickest. However, so redolent with dark magic are these artifacts that opening the reliquary is not without risk, for its power can sometimes tear apart the engine itself. Indeed, if such a dread relic is ever shattered upon the field of battle, the subsequent release of pure evil has been known to smite everything in the vicinity, living or undead, in an explosive wave of dark magic. Some reliquaries also carry blasphemous tomes to battle, or scrolls of parchment rumored to have been penned by Nagash himself. Often, the winds of magic become nigh uncontrollable when such a fell tome is near. Heavy with evil magics, these tomes are painstakingly illuminated with such effort that often their creators' souls themselves are inked upon the parchments of human skin. In battle, these books can be a boon to the twisted practitioners of necromancy, but also the bane of reckless and inexperienced spellcasters that would dare to risk relying upon such diabolical relics. Bolstering the fighting spirit of all those around it, and blasting enemy ranks with savage, dark energy, the Mortis Engines. Join me next time for Every Vampire Lord. Vampire Lords. The Vampire Lords are the eldest and greatest of their dark kind, standing above even vampire counts in terms of power and influence. A vampire who has reached the level of Vampire Lord is incredibly powerful in both his own abilities and his temporal domain. The world shakes at his will, and the bravest heroes tremble to hear his name. Only the best of the vampires reach this rank, It is not enough to simply control kingdoms or to have lived for centuries. The vampire must also be a true master of dealing death, of dominating minds, and of harnessing his strength to the utmost effect. The vampires have no gods. The vampire lords are close enough to suffice. A vampire lord is able to call upon a host of powers, the nature of which varies from vampire to vampire. Some can call forth creatures such as wolves and bats to assail the armies of the living, and sometimes they can even learn how to change into these forms. Others are able to mesmerize weak-willed mortals with barely a glance. If the vampire has a strong affinity for magic, then his necromantic abilities expand both naturally and through study. Despite these awe-inspiring powers, however, there is a terrible price to pay. As the decades become centuries, many vampires lose their minds, sliding inexorably into madness. Seafaring vampire lords are instead known as vampire fleet admirals. And here are some of the most infamous vampire lords. Aborash, the first of the Blood Knights and the mightiest of vampires. Conrad von Karstein, a bloodthirsty and unstable vampire who inherited Vlad's rule. Luthor Harkon, the mad pirate lord of the Vampire Coast. Malobord, the bastard son of Luan Leoncoeur. Manfred von Karstein, the most cunning and manipulative of Vlad von Karstein's get. He took over Sylvania after Conrad died in battle. Merovech, the Mad Duke of Mousillon. Mundvard, the Cruel, a necrarch member of the von Karsteins. Neferata, the first vampire and the founder of the Lahmian Cabal. The Red Duke, a mighty knight of Bretonnia who was turned by Aborash himself. Ushoran, the first of the devolved Ghoul Kings. Vlad von Karstein, the first and greatest Count of Sylvania. And at last, Vasoran, the first of the Necrarchs. Next, the Masters of Death itself, the Master Necromancers. Necromancers are amongst the most cursed of all those who practice the magical arts, for they have damned their souls and exchanged their humanity for the ability to raise the dead and command them to wage war upon the living. Such willingness to damn one's soul is often a sign of desperation, for at the heart of each necromancer's morbid obsession is the need to escape the inevitability of death and to subjugate and punish those who have persecuted him in the past, regardless of the cost. Once these men and women go upon this dark road, there is no going back. For although they may extend their lives beyond the mortal limit, death is still an inevitability, and the Death God shows little mercy for those who would transgress his will and deathly domain. It is usually men, rather than the longer-lived races, that delve into the study of necromancy. These few individuals are not necessarily evil to begin with. Some may desire knowledge for its own sake, others may seek immortality, or to prolong the life of a loved one. Regardless, something about their unnatural pursuit invariably turns them to a darker path. Perhaps it is the horror and revulsion their fellows feel for them, or perhaps the pulsing energy of dark magic that warps their minds. Either way, when men take to the path of necromancy, madness is just as much an inevitability as death itself. To learn the dark art, an aspirant must find either a necromancer or a vampire and become his apprentice. It is from this need to learn the dark arts that often drives necromancers to become servants of the vampire counts, hoping to learn firsthand from the masters of undeath themselves. However, such servitude often comes at a steep price, for once a vampire takes in an apprentice, they are bound to the vampire for all eternity. In order to avoid such a fate, some have gone the path of studying the forbidden lore by reading through unholy books. Seeking out books of forbidden lore has its own perils altogether. Many are copies of older texts from long forgotten times, and there is no guarantee that any of the rituals found in them are correctly transcribed. Some simply do not work at all, and others may go disastrously wrong. Even with all the danger, these individuals still persist to accomplish their goals. As a person follows the dark path of a necromancer, they become even more detached from their mortal roots, morbidly questing after the secrets of death. A necromancer who is deeply steeped in the lore of the dead stands on the threshold between worlds, neither wholly alive, nor one of the undead. Their body twisted with unholy power, their minds seared by the horrors they have witnessed. A necromancer often has more in common with their lurching, moaning minions than with the living they seek to slay. And they will rise from their graves to march upon the world of the living. Each and every mortal that falls will swell their numbers until only a world of darkness remains. Only then will the world know of the eternal order that lies within the peace of undeath. From the Grimoire Necronium, Chapter 12, from the Book of Vasoran. Now next a subclass and the true masters of necromancy, the aptly named Master Necromancers. The Master Necromancers are those few individuals whom have dedicated their entire existence to the learning and practicing of necromancy and dark magic, extending their lifespan beyond their mortal limits. These evil mages are truly powerful sorcerers that have the ability to conjure up an entire army of undead all by themselves. Ancient and malevolent beings, they have since lost all touch with their former humanity. And now a quote about the masters of necromancy. Drifting between the living and the dead, a master necromancer summons undead minions to fight enemies on his behalf. here are some of the most infamous necromancers. Arcan the Black, the Leash Lord, Frederick van Haal, Har Ak Iman, Heinrich Kemmler, the Leash Master, Kadon, Louis Cypher, Manfred von Carstein, ruler of all Sylvania, Melchior the Ancient, Mildion, Nagash, first and greatest of the necromancers, Obald the Bone Father, Petre Fons, the Madman of Mousillon, Vlad von Carstein, Vasoran, first of the Necrarchs, Zacharias the Ever-Living, the Dread King, and Helman Gorst, the chief necromancer of Manfred von Carstein. And at last, the final and most bloodthirsty and monstrous category of vampire lords, the Strigoi Ghoul Kings. The Strigoi Ghoul Kings were once proud and mighty vampires of the Strigoi bloodline that had previously ruled as masters of the ancient human civilization of Strigos and its ancient capital city of Murkane. However, ever since their downfall, these vampires have since been shunned and hunted down by other vampiric bloodlines and forced into a state of troglodyte existence. Since then, these Ghoul Kings have spent their days creeping through crypts and catacombs, awaiting the coming of night, where they would enact a dire vengeance at the head of a shambling undead army. The creation of the creature known by many as Ghoul Kings came about right after the fall of Strigos and the death of their vampire king, Ushoran. The downfall of Strigos came about when Ushoran's sister, Queen Neferata of the Lahmian bloodline, finally enacted her long-planned revenge to punish her younger brother for all the insults he had done to her over the centuries, manipulating vampires from the other bloodlines into her cause. Neferata caught the kingdom of Strigos between the armies of the undead and the hordes of greenskins that were beginning to invade the lands of the old world during the Time of Woes. With their master's death, the Strigoi vampires fled northward, where they hoped to find sanctuary from Vashanesh. However, he had no time for their perils, and fell upon his former brethren with a cold fury. After many similar bloody betrayals, the few remaining Strigoi vampires were forced to scatter themselves all across the old world in the hopes of evading persecution. Whenever they met vampires of different bloodlines, the Strigoi vampires had to hide from the wrath of their kin. From catacomb-haunted wood and moss-covered ruin, they would spy on the Lahmian and von Carstein vampires at the balls and banquets of the aristocracy. The nobility and wealth of their finely dressed kin reminded the Strigoi of what they had lost, and bitterness and envy started to gnaw at their minds. In their desolation, many of them lost their sanity completely and became solitary, pathetic parasites, wary of feeding on humans for fear of attracting the attention of witch hunters or, even worse, their own contemptuous kin. For this reason, they hid in graveyards, digging out recently buried corpses to drink their cold, fetid blood, and hiding during the day in the dank crypts near their feeding grounds. Their physical appearance soon came to reflect their miserable condition, and over the centuries, the remnants of the Strigoi turned into hunched and grotesque monstrosities. Packs of flesh-eating crypt ghouls are attracted to these dismal Strigoi and often form grotesque courts around them. Grave robbers and those who steal from the bodies of the fallen have learned well that they must practice their depraved crafts in the twilight and be home before nightfall. Under cover of darkness, different breeds of scavengers fall on these places of death. It is little wonder that the people of Sylvania refer to the Strigoi as the Ghoul Kings. Even if most of them have to some degree lost their minds during their long exile, the Ghoul Kings still possess many of the innate powers common to all vampires. They can tear out a victim's throat in the blink of an eye, and their authority over the undead and the myriad creatures of the night is still strong. The Ghoul Kings have not lost the power to raise the dead from their slumber and bind them to their will, but they do so in their own instinctual way. Their magic is less subtle than the forms of necromancy practiced by other vampires, but in the cut and thrust of combat, their savagery gives them a definite edge. At times, powerful Strigoi Ghoul Kings raise vast armies of the living dead around themselves and push south in a desperate attempt to recreate the kingdom they lost. So far, their advance has always been halted by warmongering tribes of greenskins blocking the way to the Badlands, or by disciplined armies of the Tomb Kings that stride out from the desert as an act of revenge for the vampires that destroyed their once beautiful homeland. Yet across the old world, the minions of the Ghoul Kings have been sighted ever more frequently. Some say the ancient brethren of the Strigoi are uniting under one leader and massing great armies of degenerate beasts in their cavernous lairs. If this is true, no creature, living or dead, is truly safe from their wrath. And here is the list of the most notable Strigoi Ghoul Kings. First up, Ushoran, the first and greatest of his monstrous kind. Gashnag, ruler of his own petty border principality. Druthor, a Ghoul King who fought during the End Times. Straxos, the enemy of the famed Bretonnian knight Torin, the Wanderer. And Prince Ramtep spends most of his time sleeping under Miragliano. Besides his huge collection of treasured magic items, none of the grave robbers who disturb his lair ever leave again. The heroes of death, if one could call them that, of course. First up, the White Kings. The White Kings, also known as the White Lords, were once immensely powerful human warlords that occupied the lands of present-day Sylvania in the days before the founding of the Empire. Warriors without peer, Whites have had centuries to hone their martial arts. Whites are corporeal undead, much like zombies, but they are far more dangerous. Unlike zombies, whites have lost none of their dexterity, speed, or intelligence in their rebirth. When imbued with dark magic, the bodily remains of ancient warlords rise from their crypts as White Kings, eyes glowing with unnatural life. Originally, these remains were once protected by ancient runes and talismans conducted by the earliest forms of wizards or shamans to aid in warding off potential grave robbers and scavengers from desecrating their resting places. The chieftains of the ancient tribes were buried in their full ceremonial panoply, with bronze breastplates protecting their ribs and winged helms framing their grinning skulls. The tribe's shamans placed the best swords, axes, and spears in the death grip of the ancient kings as they were laid on their slabs. The interior walls of the barrows were painted with scenes of the leader's life, so that should they awaken, they would be reminded of their greatest deeds and most heroic victories. Even today, there are still a few scattered tribes of men living with the vaults that still follow this ancient ritual. However, these once potent protections have since been destroyed, defaced or corrupted by agents of the vampire counts. Without these protections, these ancient warlords are susceptible to the corrupting influence of a particularly powerful necromancer. A few of these mounds have also been known to be conduits from which dark magic flows through, making the restless soul to continuously flicker back and forth from the world of the living and the world of the dead. In time, the amount of dark magic being gathered is enough to raise a White King from the grave without the need for a necromancer to recite the needed ritual. These events are rare, however, as most White Kings are usually raised unwillingly from their rest by determined vampires and necromancers. White Kings are incredibly powerful undead, almost as hard to destroy as vampires. Suffused with dark magic, a White King's weapon shimmers with baleful energy. The merest touch of their spear tip or blade can drain the life from their foes, or slice through flesh and bone with an ease that is wholly unnatural. Clad in ancient armor, their flesh all but withered away, there is little for an adversary to cut or stab. Even to stand before one of these skeletal warriors of antiquity takes an extreme effort of will. For these reasons, a vampire will often charge a White King with carrying forth the undead general's personal banner. Such a duty is often integral to the army's stability, and these indomitable undead warriors are able to hold aloft the army standard whilst tirelessly striking down one foe after another. I lay down to rise no more, content that my people would be well without me. Yet I told them with my dying words that if they or our lands had need of me, I would return. My people are gone now. The land has changed beyond my recognition. I do not know this place, these fields, these trees. Only the rocks of my tomb remain as they were. But the fierce ones still come from the north. there are still green skins to be driven forth, and I find that I have no mercy left in me for those that have disturbed my rest. From Sharu, the Burrow King. And here is a list of the most infamous White Kings. Krell, the White King and Mortarch of Nagash. Sir Corbignon, an undead champion of the Red Duke. Wilhelm I, a former emperor of the Empire of Man. Henri Lamorte, a former admiral in the Bretonnian Navy. Ulfric the Black-Handed, a white lord who served as Krell's lieutenant during the End Times. Bracht the Eternal, a white king who was twice defeated and slain by the famed Grail Knight Almaric of Godaron. And the Black Duke, a powerful white king who served the madman of Mousillon, Pitre Fons. And next, the Banshee. Sigmar is just. It is only fitting that such vile women should suffer such a terrifying fate. If ever you need proof of the existence of divine justice in this world, the agonized grimace of the Banshee is quite sufficient. From Forster Pike, a witch hunter. The Tomb Banshees, known by the Bretonnians as the Wailing Hags, and to the Dwarves as the Freezing Shriek, or just simply Banshees, are the bitter, restless spirits of long-dead sorceresses, enchantresses, and witches that have in life plagued the lands of the old world for centuries. They fear crossing the void to face whatever punishment awaits them for their evil deeds, and so it is an easy matter for a vampire to bind them to his service. Tomb Banshees constantly howl in remembrance of the forbidden pleasures of the life that was once theirs, and in bitterness for the peace of the grave that they cannot attain. Their grief-stricken wails can be lethal to mortals, and strike terror into the hearts of all who hear them. Those who do not have a will of iron can die of sheer fright upon hearing the mournful screams of the Tomb Banshees. Blood trickles from their ears and fills up the whites of their eyes as the mind-wrenching shriek takes its supernatural toll. Fully armored knights collapse lifeless from their saddles, and whole ranks of infantry fall lifelessly as the Banshee does her evil work. Its visage is sunken and skull-like, framed by lank hair that writhes like a nest of serpents. She is swathed in flimsy shrouds and grave robes that swirl with a life of their own, or drift and cling to the wearer's slender frame as if she was carried forwards by underwater currents. Each Tomb Banshee is surrounded by flickering ghost lights, all that remains of the men she murdered whilst alive. These glowing will-o'-the-wisps are forced by some strange alchemy of the soul to crackle and swirl around their tormentor, disembodied ghostly heads etched with a permanent expression of fear. A single Banshee is a terrifying prospect, and even those warriors skilled enough to match blades with a vampire have little defense against her unnatural screams. It is not unheard of for one of the most powerful undead lords to bind several to their service. At the siege of Ironstone Fortress, the canny vampire lord Victros von Krieger found that his infantry were being pounded to dust by artillery fire faster than he could raise them up. Even his elite troops could not breach the heavily barred stone gate at the front of the castle. Sending in the spirits of the 3 witch women that had led him down the path of necromancy in the first place, von Krieger pushed once more towards the gates. The stout ironstone doors of the fortress were proof against physical foes, but they could not keep out the deadly shrieks of the tomb banshees. With the 3 banshees howling through arrow slits and murder holes, the gate's defenders turned white and died of shock to a man. It was a simple matter for von Krieger to raise the dead guards with a necromantic spell, forcing them to unbar the gates to the castle. The first act in an eternity of servitude. Tales such as these resound throughout the lands of men, and it is a foolish warrior indeed who does not shudder at the sound of those ghostly howls in the night air. Among the elves, banshees are regarded as servants of Morai Heg, the Keeper of Souls. They allegedly arrive to announce when the time of an elf is at its end. It is also said that those who can withstand their keening cries will find immortality.